going to look at decriminalisation in detail, I thought it would be really helpful to first of all talk about what does the term decriminalisation mean, how common is it, what jurisdictions have adopted it, what are the harms associated with criminalisation, specifically within the UK, and then how do we move forward from this? How do we get decriminalisation adopted as a policy within the UK? So currently, the definition of decriminalisation that we use at release is a model whereby someone's possession of a drug, something that's termed an illegal drug, but I accept that's not necessarily the best term for it, but where you have possession of a drug that is controlled under the Misuse of Drugs Act, and instead of taking a criminal justice response to it, you take either a de jure in law response or de facto response. And de jure simply means that there is a legal system set up to respond to possession of drugs through a civil system, so an administrative system. Examples of that include Portugal and the Czech Republic, who have a formal system of decriminalisation. You have Australian states that have adopted a form of decriminalisation in respect of cannabis. Notably, they issue cannabis expiation notices for those caught in possession or who are cultivating cannabis. And in Argentina, we have legal decisions from the Supreme Court which say that it is unconstitutional to consider the possession of an illicit drug an offence, and therefore recommend that an individual should be able to possess that substance without being prosecuted through the criminal system. Then we have de facto decriminalisation, which essentially, in practice, it is decriminalised. So the Netherlands, for example, doesn't have a formal legal system of decriminalisation. What it does have is that the police respond in a specific way. So someone who is in possession of 5 grams or less of cannabis, or 1 hard dose, as they refer to it, of another substance, will not face any sanctions by the police, neither civil or criminal. So that's what we mean by decriminalisation. And where have we, the most academically reviewed model is Portugal, and I am going to go into it in a little bit of detail. So it's a de jure system. As I've stated, it's probably the most academically reviewed. So the Portuguese system. Prior to 2001, Portugal viewed drug use as the 3rd most serious social problem within the country. And it was this experience of the citizens of Portugal that led to a response, an introduction of a decriminalisation model. Prior to 2001, they had one of the most significant rates of heroin use within the EU, highest rates of drug-related death, and very high rates of HIV transmission within Portugal. However, drug use generally was quite low. And so this was a really specific response to the issue of heroin use within Portugal. And so in 2001, they adopted a 2-pronged approach. They introduced decriminalisation as a model, a legal model, whereby an individual caught in possession of a drug would be referred to an administrative court known as a dissuasion commission. And that court has the ability to respond in a number of ways. It can issue a fine, it can refer someone to treatment, it can refer them to education. But most importantly, that individual does not end up with a criminal record, which carries so much stigma and problems for the future. At the same time, they invested a significant sum of money in harm reduction. So it wasn't just decriminalisation that resulted in very positive outcomes. It was also a significant investment in harm reduction. And so between 8 years and 10 years after the introduction of this model, they saw there's been a number of analyses of what the outcomes have been. And since 2001, HIV transmission rates amongst injecting drug users have dropped from 907 cases in 2001 to 267 cases in 2008. Drug-related deaths linked to opiates and overdoses have fallen from 95% of cases of drug-related deaths in 1999 to 59% in 2008. In terms of prevalence of drug use, there has been a slight increase in terms of whole population drug use, from 7.8% in 2001 to 12% in 2010. But importantly, we've seen significant reductions in drug use in vulnerable groups. So there's been a significant reduction in heroin use, specifically intravenous use, the most harmful type, and there has been a significant reduction in young people using drugs. So about a 2%, 3% reduction amongst 15 to 19-year-olds. Interestingly, in a social and criminal justice context, what we've seen is a reduction of recidivism. So last year, 7.9% of those who were presented before the dissuasion commissions had offended in the past. That's a really low level when we look at our own rates, which are in the kind of 40, 50% rates of recidivism. The view of the enforcement agencies in Portugal has been interesting too. They were very anti the introduction of decriminalisation in 2001. And essentially, they have warmed enthusiastically to the idea. They now recognise that as police officers, the waste of resources that was being adopted to target people who use drugs. And they find that by freeing up those resources, they've been able to tackle with much more serious crimes in their community. So in 2001, there were real concerns that the opponents of decriminalisation were essentially saying that Portugal will become a place for drug tourism. We'll have people flooding in from Europe to use drugs. This hasn't been the case. This did not come to fruition. And now all the political parties support decriminalisation. They've just had their recent elections. Not one party was opposed to the model. How does it, and in the UK, when we talk about, when politicians talk about decriminalisation, excluding Caroline and other brave members of the House, but when we see government talking about it, they talk about the risk of increased prevalence of drug use. And it's simply just not borne out by the facts. So if we compare Portugal to its neighbours, Spain and Italy, which Alex Stevens did and Caitlin Hughes in their excellent paper of 2009, you can see that Portugal's drug use prevalence rates are significantly lower than that of its neighbours. Interestingly, Spain, the difference between Spain is not as significant. And Spain also has decriminalisation. Spain adopted decriminalisation in the early 70s, so it's actually nothing new for the region. And Spain has a reasonably good model of decriminalisation. So we seem to see some level of parity between the experiences of those two countries. Italy, though, is the most interesting. So Italy for years has had decriminalisation, and they've yo-yoed back and forth in terms of the thresholds that they've applied. They used to, in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, have very generous thresholds so that when someone was caught in possession of a certain level of drugs, they wouldn't be prosecuted. A number of years ago, they've changed the thresholds and they've reduced them to a level where it is no longer decriminalisation in practice. It's a hollow experience. So the level for cannabis is 250 milligrams. The level for heroin is 250 milligrams as well. So these are tiny. I mean, it's impractical. It's just never going to work. No one carries that little. If they do, it's very strange. So if we compare Italy and Portugal, what we see is that cannabis rates in the last year have shot off the roof. In Italy, so it's an increase of 8.4%. That, in terms of measuring drug use, that's statistically significant. Cocaine use is up in Italy. Problematic drug use is up. And there is a greater burden on the criminal justice system caused by drug-related offending. What about other jurisdictions? So the US, as we know, is probably the most extreme example of the failure of a harsh drug law or enforcement approach to tackle drug use levels. The US has adopted a very punitive approach and yet has the highest level of drug use in the world. Interesting though, 14 states within the US, we all know about the medical marijuana experience, but 14 states within the US have adopted decriminalisation in relation to possession of cannabis. Many of them adopted in the 1970s. There was quite a lot of research comparing use levels amongst states, neighbouring states, and the state that had adopted decriminalisation during the 70s and 80s. And what they found, and I think what we're finding as part of our research, is actually the enforcement model that you adopt has absolutely no impact on the prevalence of drug use within a society. So this was borne out by the studies in the US when comparing cannabis use. And they saw no significant statistical increase in cannabis use in those states that had adopted decriminalisation. And in fact, as Matt has put it, budget discussions around budget and financial crises have given a real opportunity in the states to really look at their drug policy. And California has estimated that by adopting decriminalisation, the cost of law enforcement around cannabis has dropped by 74% over a 10-year period. So from 17 million to 4.4 million. Another well-known jurisdiction, obviously the Netherlands. I'm not going to spend a long time on that. You all know about it. But it's promoted as the most liberalised country in terms of drug policy. And while decrim has not been legally adopted there, as I explained earlier, in practice, most people who are caught in possession of drugs will face no response from the state because of the generous thresholds that are applied by the police. A recent evaluation of the Dutch model shows that they have one of the lowest rates of drug-related deaths in the world, one of the lowest levels of injecting drug use, and they have a decrease in the number of young people who go on to use problematically. So clearly this shows that the reality is enforcement policy has no impact on drug use. But what we do know is that criminalisation causes a significant number of harms. It creates stigma. Charlie Lloyd's report for the UK Drug Policy Commission clearly linked the illegality of heroin and cocaine to the stigmatisation of people who use drugs, and found that it was a significant barrier to accessing treatment, as Matt has clearly shown or clearly stated today. In terms of employment, another study in Australia compared individuals. So different states in Australia have adopted different responses in terms of cannabis. So they looked at one state where it was treated through the criminal justice system and compared that to a state that had adopted a cannabis expiation scheme. And what they found was that those individuals who were dealt with and received a criminal sentence, that they were more likely to suffer negative employment, it would impact negatively on their relationships, on their accommodation, and they were more likely to reoffend. So we can see the impact that criminalisation has, not just in terms of how it impacts on the individual, but how it impacts in terms of society and how society needs to support that individual. In terms of employment, at release through our helpline, we see regularly the impact of a drugs conviction on an individual. So just this week, I had a call from a young man who's just started his nursing course. And he was at Notting Hill Carnival and found with a small amount of cannabis, a small amount of cocaine. And because he's going through his criminal record bureau checks, so checking for criminal convictions at the moment, he won't be able to continue on his course. So that's a real life case study of how it impacts on individuals. And in terms of young people, it impacts on their educational aspirations as well. In the UK, the current policy discriminates. It's focused on a specific group. So it is likely that if you are young and black and living in an area of deprivation, you are more likely to be caught up by the criminal justice system than someone living in Notting Hill or one of the other very nice kind of middle-class areas. So Alex Stevens' research showed that if you are black, you are 6.4 times more likely to be arrested for a drugs offence, 9.2 times more likely to be stopped and searched, and 11 times more likely to face a prison sentence for that offence, despite the fact that drug use amongst the black community is lower than the white community, and drug dealing is comparable between both communities. In terms of young people, we over-police our young people using drug policy as an excuse. So last year, the Metropolitan Police carried out 500,000 reasonable search stops. Of that 500,000, 250,000 were for drugs specifically, so under Section 23 of the Misuse of Drugs Act. Of that, they arrested 8%. So it's a real fishing expedition, and it is targeting certain groups. Of that statistic, 66% of them were under 24. And it impacts on deprivation. So as I've said, young, black, poor, you're more likely to be caught up in our criminal justice system. And this case of Hands Rising clearly shows where we have a deeply broken system that targets one group within society whilst ignoring the actions of another. Mrs. Rising was entering an event at the US Embassy. She was searched, whereupon they found a number of wraps of crack cocaine. That led to a search of her house where they found in the region of £2,000 worth of Class A substances. They got a conditional caution. That would not have happened to one of my clients in Brixton, I can promise you. And then we have the arguments from those who are opposed to drug policy reform. So the Peter Hitchens, the Melanie Phillips, the Kathy Gingles of this world, who say that we have in fact a de facto decriminalisation model in the UK. Well, no, we don't. We actually have people who have criminal convictions for drug possession. Last year, 80,000 people were found guilty or cautioned for possession of a controlled drug. Of those, 43,000 were processed through the courts, 36,000 received cautions. Their argument is that in terms of cannabis, we have cannabis warnings and we have fixed penalty notice or penalty notices for disorder, on-the-spot fines for dealing with cannabis possession. But the reality is when that system of cannabis warnings came into effect in 2003, what happened was a net widening. So more people got involved or were brought into the criminal justice system than had been before. So prior to 2003, the number of people cautioned or prosecuted for a cannabis offence was 60,000 people. In 2010, this had dropped to 44,000, but 92,000 were caught up in the cannabis warning system. So you see that huge expanse that's happened. Decriminalisation is no panacea. It only deals with the possession side. It doesn't deal with the problems of the illegal market. It doesn't deal with the problems that exist in producer countries. It doesn't deal with the transit countries where we have 42,000 dead in Mexico. It doesn't deal with inner cities that are rife with drug dealing, where we have kids as young as 12 who are having to deal in order to support their families, etc. But what it does do is it is an immediate response that can reduce harms straight away, and it provides us with a space for debate to look at the alternatives. So I've just been given my 2 minutes, so I'm going to just quickly go through this. I read an interesting article in The Guardian last week about a guy called Carl Week, who I hadn't come across before, who was an organisational theorist, wrote prolifically throughout the 70s and 80s. And what he said was that actually sometimes that when you're trying to convince the world that you're fighting a very serious problem, it can be difficult for them to hear that. And actually small battles can actually trigger, can deliver motivation and can trigger a snowball effect. And I think decriminalisation is actually something that we can achieve within the UK. And that's why Release has launched its Better Drug Laws campaign, which saw a letter being sent to the Prime Minister on the 2nd of June calling for a review of drug policy and for decriminalisation as a serious policy goal. And we'll continue the campaign throughout 2011, 12 and 13. And we're going to focus on research around the disproportionate policing and prosecution of individuals within drug policy. So looking specifically at how black people are impacted upon, how young people are impacted on, and the deprivation levels. And we think, looking at the stats, what we can see is that depending on the response within the criminal justice system, that you are more likely to receive a cannabis warning if you're white than if you're black. And that as you move through the severity, you're more likely to be black when we look at the harsher responses. So we think that's going to be a really interesting piece of work that we're working with the LSC on. The other area that we'll be looking at is the criminal justice costs. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a very crude evaluation of each of the elements and the costs associated with it. So how much is a stop and search? How much is a cannabis warning? How much does it cost caution? Court costs, custodial costs, probation costs, and try and really demonstrate to the public that this is a very expensive regime that is failing this country absolutely miserably. So thank you. I'm going to look at decriminalisation in detail. I thought it would be really helpful to first of all talk about what does the term decriminalisation mean, how common is it, what jurisdictions have adopted it, what are the harms associated with criminalisation, specifically within the UK, and then how do we move forward from this? How do we get decriminalisation adopted as a policy within the UK? So currently, the definition of decriminalisation that we use at release is a model whereby someone's possession of a drug, something that's termed an illegal drug, but I accept that that's not necessarily the best term for it, but where you have possession of a drug that is controlled under the Misuse of Drugs Act, and instead of taking a criminal justice response to it, you take either a de jure in law response or de facto response. And de jure simply means that there is a legal system set up to respond to possession of drugs through a civil system, so an administrative system. Examples of that include Portugal and the Czech Republic, who have a formal system of decriminalisation. You have Australian states that have adopted a form of decriminalisation in respect of cannabis. Notably, they issue cannabis expiation notices for those caught in possession or who are cultivating cannabis. And in Argentina, we have legal decisions from the Supreme Court which say that it is unconstitutional to consider the possession of a criminal. So that's what we mean by decriminalisation. And where have we, the most academically reviewed model is Portugal, and I am going to go into it in a little bit of detail. So it's a de jure system. As I've stated, it's probably the most academically reviewed. So the Portuguese system. Prior to 2001, Portugal viewed drug use as the third most serious social problem within the country. And it was this experience of the citizens of Portugal that led to a response, an introduction of a decriminalisation model. Prior to 2001, illicit drug an offence, and therefore recommend that an individual should be able to possess that substance without being prosecuted through the criminal system. Then we have de facto decriminalisation, which essentially, in practice, it is decriminalised. So the Netherlands, for example, doesn't have a formal legal system of decriminalisation. What it does have is that the police respond in a specific way. So someone who is in possession of 5 grams or less of cannabis, or 1 hard dose, as they refer to it, of another substance, will not face any sanctions by the police, neither civil or